the good news of salvation that this world so desperately needs to hear. My message today, as somebody has already pointed out, is a little wacky for title. It's called Wishy, Washy for Christ. And I will tell you that it's hard to find someone very committed today to anything, let alone to Christ. I hear a lot of strong opinions and I hear a lot of strong ideas, but as soon as something goes wrong, people seem to back down quite quickly. It seems amazing to me that we find ourselves as a people who do go strongly up until things don't look good, and then we just let it go. And that's nothing new, because Israel was just like us. God had delivered them from slavery from Egypt and had led them to the promised land, and everything looked good. They sent spies into the land, but the spies came back with some bad news. And just like all people always, they let a little bad news overwhelm their faith in God. Our first scripture today is Numbers 13, verses 25 through 28. And it says, at the end of the 40 days, they returned from spying on the land. And they came to Moses and Aaron and the congregation of the people of the wilderness of Paran and Kadesh. And they brought back the word to them, the congregation, and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told him, we came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruits. However, the people who dwell in that land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Now, the Anak were the giants. They were the predecessors of guys like Goliath. And they're big cities. And this is a few people that have just spent the last few hundred years in slavery. But the land, as God promised, flows with milk and honey. They just weren't expecting the milk and honey to come with opposition. They were hoping that somehow the promised land would come with ease and no work. They also were hoping for a very smooth transfer. And I think if you're really honest with yourself, we do still have that attitude. What I call prosperity gospel people, and you hear a lot of them on TV, they will be the ones who say, you know, if you give me $20, God will give you 1,000. Or if you type amen on Facebook, you're going to receive a blessing. Those kind of ideologies that says God is just going to give you stuff real easily. Just do something simple and it'll come. Now, I will not tell you that God does not bless. And he does sometimes bless us enormously more than we need and deserve. But I'm here to tell you that the idea that everything in life for a Christian comes smoothly and easily without trouble is a fallacy. In fact, what Jesus had told his disciples was that you will have tribulation. The world hated me, and they're going to hate you. And there are going to be times where walking the Christian walk requires us to go through difficult things. The Israelites were facing the promised land. God had so far brought them along. Now, the trip from the Red Sea, where they were parted from Egypt's army, to Canaan, was a period of maybe a few weeks. They really didn't have to spend a lot of time in the wilderness. But when they heard the spies talk about the sons of Anak and the walled cities, they got nervous. And Numbers 14, verses 1 through 4 says, then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And the whole congregation said to them, would that we had been in the land of Egypt, or would we have died in this wilderness? Why is it that the Lord is bringing us to a land to fall by the sword? Our wives and little ones will become prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to one another, "Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt." Now these people had just escaped slavery. They had been spending time in Egypt, being mistreated, and they cried out to the Lord for deliverance. And God delivered them. And now they are wanting to say, "Let's find us a new leader and let's go back to Egypt and see if we can get our old jobs back." I find that kind of attitude just almost impossible to believe, except I see it in myself. I see it in the people of today. We want to have trouble-free lives. We want to not have to trust God through hard times. And if it were such a thing that this just happens occasionally, it wouldn't be so bad. But the truth of it is, just like Israel, at the first sign of trouble, I want to flee back to Egypt. Now, I'm going to tell you something as we sit to read in the next scriptures. This does not please God. And I'm here to tell you that when I tell you to read the Old Testament, because it's an open book test, this is a perfect example. Here's what Israel did, and here's what God thought about it. Do I want to be in the same position as those people? And that's a question I think we need to ask as we go through these scriptures. Because to be honest with you, if this angered God 4,000 years ago, trust me, it still angers him today. Numbers 14, verses 26 through 35. "And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, How long shall this wicked congregation grumble against me? I have heard the grumblings of the people of Israel, which they have grumbled against me. Say to them, As I live, declares the Lord, what you have said in my hearing I will do to you. Your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness, and all your number listed in the census from 20 years old and upward, who have grumbled against me. Not one shall come into the land where I swore it would make you dwell, except for Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. But you little ones who said you would become prey, I will bring in, and they shall know the land that you have rejected. But as for you, your dead bodies shall fall in the wilderness, and your children shall be shepherds in the wilderness 40 years, shall suffer for your faithlessness, until the last of your dead bodies lie in the wilderness. According to the number of days in which you spied out the land, 40 days, a year for each day, you shall bear your iniquity. 40 years, and you shall know my displeasure. I, the Lord, have spoken. Surely this will do this wicked congregation who gathered together against me in the wilderness. They shall come and fall at the end, and there shall they die. Now, for those folks who tell me that God is all love and there's no condemnation in God, and they will go, ooh, seems like God was having a bad day. The truth of the matter is, Israel was having the bad day. God had thus far done everything he had promised Israel. He had brought them to the promised land, which did indeed flow with milk and honey. The only problem was that land wasn't empty. And they were going to have to go in and they were going to have to conquer. And when they balked, then God says, that's it. Go back out. You wanted to die in the wilderness? Guess what? You will spend 40 years in the wilderness, and every one of you who balked at following my word will in fact die in the wilderness. Only two of that generation, Caleb and Joshua, ended up going into the land of Canaan. With God, it is dangerous to take his promises lightly. With God, it is dangerous to take what he promises to do lightly. He had given them the promised land, even though they couldn't see how, even though they couldn't understand how they were going to overcome these giants. God had already arranged that. But when they did, hesitate, when they became wishy-washy, as my words were, then they frankly did not follow God. And I will suggest to you that their sin was not just fear or doubt, but it was at a point where they were looking at God's plan and saying, you know what, I think I have a better plan. Or I really don't approve of God's plan today, so we'll go with a plan C. They believed in God, but only when it was easy and convenient. And unfortunately, that is something that I find within myself today, and I see within the church even more so. You would think that we would learn, and unfortunately what we seem to do is to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. I will find myself, if I don't look at myself truly in the eyes of these Israelites, falling in the same shoes. And let's face it, God is very displeased with that attitude. You should not expect that God's going to be any less displeased with you when you are same attitude with God. When you say, yes, God, I'm going to follow you, well, wait a minute. You're saying go up against this? Nah, that's more than I want to handle, God. Let's go plan C there. And it's interesting because once God told the Israelites what was going to happen, once they found out that they were going to go out into the desert and they were all going to die in the desert, amazingly, they went, you know, maybe God's plan doesn't sound so bad after all. Maybe we'll go ahead and go on in because, you know, after all, facing giants, dying for certain in the desert with unmarked graves, I guess we'll face giants. The problem with that attitude is they're getting right with God. They're doing what God told them to do, but only after they first told God, no, thank you. And that being wishy-washy doesn't fly with God. And Numbers 14:39 through 42 show us just exactly what's going on. And when Moses told these words to all the people mourned greatly. And they rose early in the morning and went up on the heights of the hill, saying, here we are. We will go to the place the Lord has promised, for we have sinned. But Moses said, why now are you transgressing the command of the Lord? What then will not succeed? Do not go up, for the Lord is not with you, lest you be struck down by your enemies. When they realize the options are die in the desert or face giants, they're willing to do what God called them to do in the first place. But only because they didn't like the second option. God had promised to take them into the promised land and deliver it to them. However, their lack of faith caused them to be subjected to the desert. They now wanted to change their minds again. When you look at the term wishy-washy, which I don't think, we were talking about it earlier, that ain't is now in the dictionary, but I don't think wishy-washy is. But you all know what wishy-washy is. It's like, well, I'm going this way, no, I'm going that way, I'll just change. And the people of Israel are doing that. And if I'm honest, I've caught myself doing it. I'll say, Lord, I don't think I want to go the rate you want to go. And he's going, okay, then if you don't want to go my way, I'm going to give you a worse way. Well, in that case, Lord, let's go back to plan A. You see, what God is asking you to do is to trust him, to have faith, and not second guess everything he does. And the thing about the Israelites they were more than willing to face those giants when they knew the other option was dying in the... It's not appropriate to play bargain with God. If you remember that Jesus had a parable about two sons, and the first son was asked to go out in the field and do work, and he said, no, I don't think so, Dad. And so the dad went to the second son, and the second son says, yeah, I'll go out and I'll do it. I'll go out in the field. Well, the first son, after thinking about it for a while, realized that he was wrong and went out anyway. The second son, on the other hand, promised to do something and then didn't. Jesus' words were to praise the first son. Even though he had not done immediately what God had asked him to do, his conscience told him that doing what God told him to do was the right thing. The second son, however, promised to do the right thing and then did not. Much like those two sons, we follow Christ, either doing it because we know we should or desiring to try and change the rules to fit us. We cannot bend God's will to ours, and too often we want to. Now, like I said, I wish I could tell you this is a one-time sin, but I see it in myself. I see it played out today. And unfortunately, the sin of Israel is also the sin of Rick and of the church today. When I want to put conditions on serving God, when I make judgments based on my own will and not God's, I, like Israel, fail. And I cannot and should not take that sin lightly. If God's anger put all of that generation back in the wilderness to die for 40 years, I want to be very careful about following their example. I want to make sure that I don't have that same mindset. Because to be honest with you, the God of the Old Testament is the God of the New Testament. I've heard many people say, well, I like the God of the New Testament, but I'm not real fond of the God of the Old Testament. My friends, that is the same God. The rules still apply. The problem with the Old Testament is we see too often what sin looks like and the consequences of that sin. And we see that God is a just God. To consider that we are not under that same judgment is a fool's category, and we do not want to be there. In today's world, being wishy-washy is normal. You stand for nothing and you fall for everything. But make no mistake, being wishy-washy for God does not please God. There is no question that you cannot do it your way. You know, Burger King had a saying one time, have it your way. Well, Jesus Christ never told you that. If you want to have it your way, go to Burger King. If you want to do it God's way, you need to listen to God. There are only two individuals from that generation that made it into the promised land. Both Joshua and Caleb, who went in as fighters and elderly men in their 80s, I believe it was. Because they alone stood against the naysayers when they said, no, we can't go in against giants. Joshua and Caleb said, oh yes, we can, because God has already promised it to us. And I believe Joshua and Caleb is a sign for you and me today as to how we should live in such an indecisive world. To tell you that you will face trials as a Christian today is one of those things that I shouldn't have to tell you. You are going to face trials. It's not going to be easy. And in fact, in today's world, being called a Christian is synonymous with being called crazy, or in some cases, I've even heard us called terrorist, because we're not tolerant of every sin. Those around us will not understand why we follow God. They will not understand why we take the path we do. And that's okay. I don't mind not being understood by the world. In fact, I should expect the world not to understand. But I'm here to tell you where I don't want to be is in the same shoes as those Israelites who second-guessed God, who second-guessed God's plan and said that, well, God, let's see if we can't do a better plan than you. Because what happened to those Israelites is what God is planning for you and me if we do not follow him. I guarantee you this: you cannot serve Christ and serve your own will in the same way. One has to bend. You cannot have independent free will and call yourself a Christian. As a Christian, I must say, I serve God. I will follow where God takes me, and sometimes I will be honest. Where he takes me is not comfortable. Sometimes he's going to call you to face giants. And I will be honest with you, that's scary. But I said, fear was not the sin of the Israelites. It was putting their choices and their wills over God's. To be honest with you, God has promised all of us a promised land in heaven. And I'm here to tell you that now is not the time to become wishy-washy about his will. Yes, you will face struggles. Yes, you will face hard times. But my friends, if God says, I will take you home, you can go with that assurance. The Israelites did go into Canaan. They did conquer those giants. They did overwhelm those walled cities. They took over that land because they said, this is what God told us to do. They did what God asked them to do. Their parents could have done the same thing, but they got wishy-washy. My friends, you cannot afford to be wishy-washy for Christ. There is too much at stake. There's too much that we will lose if we don't follow God and his first choice. And that's what I have for you. Thank you.